My original plan for this video was to talk about sound particles, the standalone application, because this was one of the topics that had been requested previously. However, a couple of days before I recorded this video, Sound Particles came out with a new service, or a new subscription service to be exact, which they call Explorer Sound Effects Cloud. And as it turns out, that integrates very nicely into Sound Particles, the standalone application, and creates a really unique and interesting package. So I decided to expand the scope of this video a little and not only talk about Sound Particles, the standalone application, but also about Sound Particles Explorer and the new Sound Particles Sound Effects Cloud. And with that being said, let's get right into it. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And since you're already at it, also please don't forget to press the like button, especially if you get any value out of my videos. It really helps out the channel and makes my videos more visible to other people. Thank you very much. Now, when people talk about sound particles, they usually talk about the plugins. These are very unique and allow you to do a couple of things that no other plugins can do. But if you're not familiar with sound particles actually started out differently. They started out with a standalone application that is called Sound Particles. And this is actually their main offering still to this day. And what it really does is it allows you to create soundscapes through the use of particle systems. And this is a very unique approach to sound design. This is the only software that at least I'm aware of that can do that, and therefore they also have a very broad user base in the audio post-production community, simply because if a sound designer wants to create a huge sound for a movie, this is one of the ways they can actually do that. In addition to the Sound Particles standalone application, they also provide a library manager, and that library manager is actually fairly unique as well, because it is one of the few library managers that is capable of handling multi-channel audio and immersive audio. Now that library manager is called Explorer, and it now comes in two different versions. There used to be only a free version, which you can simply download, install, and use it however you see fit. But it also now comes as a paid version as part of a subscription service. And this subscription service gives you access to a fairly extensive sound effects library. And that is actually a very interesting offering. Now, in terms of pricing, these tools don't necessarily come super cheap, but they are aimed at professionals. So kind of considering that, I think that the pricing is about right. The Sound Particles standalone application is something that you can either subscribe to or you can buy a perpetual license. For individuals, that perpetual license is currently on sale for $300, which is, kind of not cheap, but it's not that expensive either. If you're a company, essentially you have to pay a little bit more than that. And then the really nice thing is that if you're an academic institution or a teacher or a student, it is actually completely free. And that's really, really cool. It's one of the few companies who actually do that. So if you are a student, if you're a teacher, you can actually access that completely for free. Now, when it comes to the Explorer Sound Effects Cloud subscription, unfortunately, that does not provide a free academic license, at least not that I'm aware of. So you need to purchase it. It currently costs $200 a year or $20 a month, which sounds like a lot, but it actually isn't, because most of the companies that are providing subscription service to sound effects are significantly more expensive, sometimes 10 times more expensive than that. So if you are a hobbyist or a kind of semi-professional or even a professional that wants to have access to a sound effects library that is comprehensive but also not too expensive, then this is actually a really, really good option. And with that being said, let's have a look at the software itself. Now, I first need to point out that I purchased licenses for all of the things that I'm going to show you today. I actually have individual licenses, so I'm not going to use the academic licenses. I actually have my own. And this is also not sponsored in any way. So I had a chat with Sound Particles. These are really, really nice people that I think are really passionate about what they're doing, but this video is not sponsored in any way. So everything that I'm going to talk about is strictly my own opinion. So let's first have a look at the Sound Particles standalone application. And what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to start an empty project and play around with it a little. Now, as soon as you start a project or open a project, you're greeted with the user interface. And the user interface is fairly straightforward. It feels feels a lot like a game engine if you ever worked with one of those. So essentially what you have is you have a traditional kind of isometric view, and then you have like the perspective here that you can move around and turn around like in three-dimensional space. Now here on the right side we have sort of an inspector window, and on the bottom we have the individual objects that we have in our sound particles project. The main idea of the software is actually fairly straightforward. What you're doing is you're creating particles that are located in three-dimensional space, and these particles act as sound emitters. And you can have individual particles, or you can have entire particle systems. And these particle systems can be quite large. Now, why would you want to do that? Now, for example, let's say, for example, that you want to create a simulation of a stadium environment where you have tens of thousands of people. Then what you could technically do is you could create a particle for each of those individual people, and then essentially create an entire sound sphere around that. So what it essentially allows you to do is it allows you to mimic crowd simulations, to mimic anything that requires large amounts of different sounds coming, or similar sounds coming from different directions, like for example, as I said before, in a stadium environment. Now here on the bottom we have the individual objects that we can add, and there are essentially three types of objects that we can add. We can add an audio track, we can add particle systems, either as a particle group with a particle emitter, and we're going to kind of talk about that later, or we can also add microphones. And that essentially means that you can work with different microphones simultaneoly. When you start it up for the first time, it comes up with a stereo microphone. This is what I have here, but you can also kind of change that to, for example, an ambisonics microphone. So for example, I can decide to make that microphone an ambisonics microphone or a multi-channel microphone, and then essentially kind of choose whatever is appropriate for me. And what sound particles will essentially do is it will then, when I render everything, it will actually render it in exactly the way it is recorded through that particular microphone. Now, in addition to that, and I'm not going to talk about that too much, you can also automate that microphone. So for example, you could move it around in three-dimensional space, kind of mimicking certain motion or movements that you have, and that's also something that you can do. So let's set that back to a stereo microphone, and let's first add an audio track. And kind of if you add an audio track, the idea is that this is sort of really more meant to be an ambient audio track. So let's just add one. Once we add an audio track, what we need to do is we need to select an audio file. And there are different ways on how you can do that. You can use your own library, you can use your own samples and kind of just drop them in here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to Sound Effects Explorer and kind of show you how that actually integrates with that particular sample library manager. So here we have Sound Particles Explorer with a Sound Effects Cloud subscription, and what it essentially allows you to do, it allows you to access the sounds that are in part of that description in the cloud. Now, some of you might be concerned about the fact that this is sort of in the cloud, and I essentially need an internet connection in order to gain access to those. However, be aware that when you're talking about these types of sound effects libraries, they tend to be very, very, very large. So if you're thinking about something like, for example, a boom library kind of a package that can be up to 40, 50 gigabytes of data. And so having that in the cloud and just kind of downloading the things that you need for that particular project is actually, in my opinion at least, a real advantage. Now, the basic principles are very, very simple. You have everything organized here on the left side, and they actually made a very nice job in creating a kind of a starting point that contains a lot of sound effects for all kinds of purposes. When we're talking about games, for example, the first thing that we always look is, are there any footsteps? And let me just kind of scroll down here and to they even farts. I'm not quite sure if you if you want to be very funny, but let's just kind of, where are the footsteps? No, I'm kind of confused by the farts. Footsteps. Here we are, the footsteps. So there are actually quite a few footsteps. And the next thing, if you're working in game design, we always want to see is guns. And obviously, we also have a lot of guns. So if you're working in game audio, this is actually already a very, very interesting kind of starting point that provides you most of the things that you will probably need. And the basic idea is very, very simple. So you select the sound that you want to have. So for example, I'm selecting here this 200-person audience talking, which I think is the very first sound in the in the alphabetic order. And if once you select it, it will download it, and once it's downloaded, you can simply play that. So let me just I probably need to kind of put on my headphones in order to hear anything. So let's just play that. and then you essentially have that sound effect. Now, one of the really nice things about sound effects or Sound Particles Explorer is that this is a sample library manager that allows you to convert sound formats. So if you, for example, have a stereo file and you want a version that is a kind of a 7.1.2 version, for example, you can simply kind of convert that. And the way to do that is simply by going here to the multi-channel version and maybe selecting 7.1.2, and then essentially it is converting that into 7.1.2. Now, if you're converting from stereo into another multi-channel format, that is not particularly interesting, because what it essentially will do is it will kind of just take the stereo channels and then add the additional channels. Where it gets really interesting is if you want to convert that, for example, into ambisonics, or if you have an ambisonics file that you want to convert into a multi-channel format. And for that, let's just kind of maybe go into, just check out an ambisonics file. And if I'm not completely mistaken, under the sports section, so let me just go to sports. Where are sports? Here we are sports. In indoor, if I'm not completely mistaken, we have a couple of ambisonics files. Now I'm going to order everything according to the number of channels. What they usually provide is first order ambisonics, so those are essentially 4-channel files. So let's just kind of click that and the other direction. So yeah, so we have, for example, a couple of essentially bowling sounds. So let's just kind of look at that. And that is essentially as we see, a 4-channel first order ambisonics. And it will essentially kind of play correctly. So if I'm now playing that, so let me just play that. So I just hope that this is sort of a kind of a strike. I'm not completely sure. But what you can do now is you can convert that into any other format that you want. So if, for example, you can convert that. If you're working with Dolby Atmos, for example, and you want to use that for a Dolby Atmos bed, you can simply convert that into 7.1.2. And that will then essentially give you the sound in 7.1.2 format. And then what you can do is you can export that. So if I'm now playing as export as, what I can essentially do is I'm going to click here and I can simply export that. I can select the channel ordering in case you need different types of channel ordering, the bit depth, the sample rate, and kind of these types of things, and then simply press OK, and that will then essentially save that. Let's just save that onto the desktop and save that as a test file. And that is going to export everything. And I now have that that ambisonics file in 7.1.2 format that I can essentially then use for a Dolby Atmos bed, for example. So this is a kind of a feature that is quite often overlooked, but which I think is really, really interesting, because at least to my knowledge, it's the only sample library manager that allows you to really convert between different types of formats, going up to even NHK 22.2 format. But let's go back to our Sound Particles application. What I want to do now is I want to use Sound Particles Explorer in order to send over sound effects into Sound Particles directly. Unfortunately, I can't do a drag and drop, so that unfortunately is not possible, but there's actually an easy way to just send sound over. And for that purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, let me change the sound that I'm using, because that's probably not particularly useful here. Let's just maybe use that one. Discard changes. Yes, I don't want to save that. And let's just downloading that. And I think that is just sort of kind of a full ambience in a bowling alley, which is nice. And let's just switch that over and let's just turn that into something that is stereo. Now, before I send sound over to Sound Particles, I also need to make sure that the settings in Sound Particles are set up correctly, so that the audio track is actually receiving the correct audio signal. So if I'm sending over a stereo signal, for example, I want that audio track to actually be stereo that receives that audio. So let me go back to Sound Particles, and in Sound Particles, if I'm selecting that audio track, I essentially here on the right can select what type of audio that actually is. Now, in my particular case, what I want to do is I want to send over a stereo track, so I would need that to stereo. But but you can also kind of do that with 5.1, 7.1, or even ambisonics. Now, if you're choosing ambisonics, be aware that what sound particles is essentially doing is it is converting the ambisonics file into particles. So instead of actually kind of introducing it as an actual ambisonics file, it will actually create a couple of particles, and you can actually select how many particles you want to use in order to represent that ambisonics file. So you can use six sound sources up to 600. So if you want to be particularly accurate, you can kind of blow that up to 600 sound sources. But what I'm going to do here is we're simply going to use a stereo track here. And the one thing that you might not see on, especially if you're on a small screen, is that we have two dots here that represent left and right channel. And let me just see if I can zoom in here. Yes. So once again, you might not see that because that's a simple pixel here, but sort of you have the particles are represented in your user interface, and you essentially see where the left and the right channel is. If there would be one thing that I would ask sound particles to do, is to make these particles maybe a little bit more visible. They are kind of really, really small and difficult to see, which makes sense if you're working with large amounts of particles, and we're going to do that in a second. But for this particular applications where I'm kind of just bringing in an audio file, and it's a little difficult to see. So once again, we have here, in case you don't see that, the left channel, and here the right channel. So now with that, let's kind of go back to our Explorer session. And in Explorer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send that over to sound particles. And the way to do that is by simply going here down to the spot to session. And here I can sort of select where I'm going to send that to: Pro Tools, Reaper, Logic, Nuendo, Cubase. Those are the ones that are currently working, or sound particles themselves. And all I really need to do is I need to click on sound particles, and that will essentially move that over. Now, this was originally an ambisonics file, and I've converted that into stereo, so I can choose to either send over the original or the edited version. I want to send over the edited version so that I have a stereo file. And as soon as I send that over, it will actually start playing here. So let me just stop that, because that's sort of just the... Let's just disable the autoplay, and I now have it here in the audio track. So if I'm playing the kind of project now, I will actually hear that file in stereo. And this is one way to allow you to essentially kind of bring in different ambient sounds, and kind of you can position them in three-dimensional space. But where this software really shines is with the use of particle systems. So instead of just having like two sound sources, like for a left and right channel, or maybe kind of a couple of sound sources for multi-channel format, what you can do is you can have sound sources that have hundreds, thousands, or even millions of different sound particles that are all floating around in three-dimensional space. And this is essentially what I want to do now. And for this purpose, let's maybe think about a situation where you're on a boat and you have a couple of seagulls kind of flying around, and let's see how I could actually create that. Now, for that purpose, what I'm going to do is, well, first of all, let me delete that audio track because we don't really need that anymore. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a particle system, and I'm going to first work with a particle group. Now, as soon as you add that, you essentially see the... Let me just kind of bring that into focus a little. You essentially see the particles that are created. These are randomly created. You can select the way these particles are created. So let me just kind of click here, and essentially what we can do is in the start zone, we can select what kind of the geometry is that these particles are. So in this particular case, I chose a torus, but I can also kind of do, for example, them on a sphere, or I can essentially do that in a circle, inside a circle, or directly on the circle, and you have different types of things. Now for us, because we are thinking of seagulls kind of flying around a boat, let's maybe, for example, kind of do the torus. Now, in addition to the geometry, you can also control the number of particles that you have in that geometry. So for example, what I can do is I can go into the settings of that particle group, and I can say I want to have 100 particles, or maybe I kind of want to have more, and you can have as many as you want. It kind of maxes out at 100,000. We're probably not going to have 100,000 birds around our boat, but kind of, who knows? kind of maybe you're doing something, once again, if you, for example, have like an audience in a stadium, you might actually have that many. But in our case, let's kind of scale that down again and maybe come back to something that you guys are actually going to see on screen, because once again, every particle here is just a pixel, and that might be a little small. So let's say something like 200. That's fine. It's a lot of birds, but who knows? We are in an environment where we have a lot of birds. So let's go back into Sound Explorer and let's see if we find a kind of a sound that would fit. And I think we have a bird category. Let me just go up here. And we have boats. No, we're not boats. Birds. Seabirds. Okay, here we are. And there's a seagull. So let's see how that actually sounds. Or let's hear how that sounds. Yeah, that works. So let's move that over into sound particles. So once again, the only thing I really need to do is I need to select the track that I'm moving that into, which I've already done, and then I essentially need to just click on the spot to button, and it will essentially move it over to sound particles. So let's just click on that, and as soon as I do that, I essentially have that here. So the birds are now part of that particle group. If I'm now playing the project, I'm going to hear the sound only once because all particles are essentially playing at the same time. So if I now press play, I just should hear the particles. Now, if you're not hearing anything, you might need to render that first. And that can be done by simply pressing the render button here. And that will essentially make sure that you're rendering that. That might be particularly important if you have a lot of particles like we have here, for example. There are like 200 particles. So this can't do that really always in real time. Sometimes you actually need to render that, but it's really trying to catch up. So in most of the cases, it functions as if it would be real time. But once again, if you have a lot of particles, you might need to re-render everything. So we now have these birds now, but they're all playing at the same time, and you don't really want that because once again, you're kind of those are different birds. So one thing that we can do, for example, is we can add a delay. So if we go into, and let me just make that a little bit smaller that you see that here, we essentially have modifiers here, modifier options. And what we can do is we can add all kinds of modifiers. You can either add movement modifiers, meaning that essentially these particles are moving in three-dimensional space, or you can add audio modifiers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a delay modifier, and that is a sort of a random delay. And in this random delay, let's just say 2 seconds is probably a little bit too short, because that means that all particles are playing in an amount of 2 seconds, which kind of 200 birds screaming in 2 seconds, it's going to be a mess. What I'm going to do is I'm going to simply add that, or kind of extend that to, let's say, 100 seconds. And then essentially when I play that, I should essentially hear the individual birds coming in one after the other at a certain random amount of time. And they're coming from different directions. Now I can add a little bit variety to that, because they are all kind of having the same voice. But one thing that I can do, for example, I can add another modifier, which might be a filter modifier, a random filter, for example. And I'm just going to keep that in the standard settings here, because that seems to work quite well. So if I'm now doing that, the individual particles are associated with a particular filter. And that already sounds a lot more realistic. Now, the next thing that I can do is I can also create a little bit of movement, because obviously these birds are not going to stay in the air still, so they're actually flying. So let's just add a movement modifier. What we can do, for example, we can add a little bit of velocity to the rotational movement. And let's just play that, how that sounds. And we will actually see how these particles are moving in our user interface. And once again, I apologize, this is actually fairly small. I might actually kind of zoom in when I'm editing this video, but sort of you see these birds kind of moving around. And this allows you to create realistic kind of environments. Now, in addition to particle group, you can also do something that's called a particle emitter. And a particle emitter is actually not that different to a particle group where you have a delay in the audio that's playing. The idea really is that the particles are coming in at a certain time intervals. The reason you might want to use a particle emitter instead of a particle group with a delay is that with a particle emitter, you have a little bit more control over the timing of those those sounds. So let me just add a particle emitter here. And in the sound, let's choose a different sound. Let's go back into our Explorer and let's do, I don't know, something. What do we have here? Screecher. Maybe that's a bird that's also there. So let's just move that over. Let's click on sound particles. It's going to move that over. Okay, and now we have the particle emitter. Now in the particle emitter, let's set the individual options. Currently it's set up at a rate of 10 particles per second for a duration of 3 seconds. I'd like to kind of make that larger. I'd like to kind of make that once again like the 100 seconds that I had. And 10 particles per second is probably a lot. I just want to have like maybe, I don't know, a couple of, maybe 1 per second. Let's see how that sounds with 1 per second. And let's just play how that sounds now. Now that is probably still a bit much, so let's just bring that down to maybe like 0.2 per second. And then we can do the same thing that we did also for the particle system. So for the particle group, we can add modifiers. So let's add in the same way, maybe a random filter to kind of give it a little bit more variety in terms of the filtering. And then let's maybe also add a little delay, because you might have noticed that these particles are coming in at exactly essentially 0.2 seconds, and that is a little bit too regular. So let's just add a little bit of a delay, and I'm going to keep the delay, the standard delay here, so that sort of 2 seconds that kind of is this additional kind of delay that's added here. So let's just play how that sounds now. And that sounds actually already fairly good. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that you need to do in order to get it to a realistic sound, but you can sort of see that this is a piece of software that really is very unique, because it allows you to create these systems of sounds that you couldn't create otherwise. So if you would do the same thing with a regular digital audio workstation, you would actually have to do a lot of work. And here it's essentially just a particle system that you're playing around with. And then once you're done, the thing that you need to do is you need to simply export that. So let's go into the file settings and let's say export, and export the audio, and then essentially it's going to export that. I can select in what type of format I want that. Now the microphone that I'm using here, I have only one microphone in that system, is a stereo mic. So essentially I can only select stereo here, but I can choose the bit depth and the sample rate, and then essentially I press OK, and it's going to put that onto the desktop or wherever I want that to be, and I'm going to say save, and then here we are, and let's just play that. And once again, if you used a different microphone, for example, an Ambisonics microphone, then you would have a fully immersive audio file. You would have an Ambisonics file that you can then simply kind of bring into your game or into your movie production, into your post-production workflow, and that works actually quite well. Now, one final thing that I should probably mention is that in addition to all the things that we have done here, we can also add automation. And automation is, for those of you who are working with digital audio workstations, is fairly self-explanatory. So essentially what you need to do is you need to go down to this plus button here, and you can open it up. And as soon as you open it up, you have different options for automation. So you can automate the audio, the emitter, the position, and you can also automate all modifiers that you put in there. So for example, if I want to automate the volume, I can do that, and I can, in the very same way I would do that with the digital audio workstation, put in points here and essentially kind of add an animation in the audio, and that then allows you to really kind of optimize your sounds and make things sound as realistic as humanly possible. Now, there are a couple of things that I didn't touch on. For example, one thing that you can do is you can bring in CGI files in order to kind of match the sound particles to particular CGI workflow. So for example, if you're working with somebody who is doing 3D modeling for for certain special effects, then you can use those files in order to kind of also kind of match the sound particles that are used for creating the sound effects. Now, this is something that most of us who are semi-professional or hobbyists, and this is my core audience, probably never will get around doing, but if you're a professional, this is certainly a nice add-on that allows you to really kind of bring that software into your standard CGI workflow. So that's really everything I wanted to talk about today. What is my final verdict? Well, to be perfectly honest, sound particles is a fairly unique piece of software. So if you are working in the audio post-production industry, then you have most likely already sound particles. Or if you don't have it yet, you actually need it, because there's nothing comparable on the market, at least not that I'm aware of. And it does kind of simplify your workflow quite a bit. For those of us who are more on the hobbyist and kind of semi-professionals way, it depends. It is not particularly expensive, so it's not as expensive as professional software tends to be, but it kind of it costs a little. So it's something that you need to think about. In terms of the sound effects cloud subscription, I do believe that is actually a really, really good value. $200 is for about 100,000 sound effects is actually really, really nice. It has all the sounds that you would normally need in game development, in all kinds of applications. Whether or not the subscription is worth it will depend a lot on whether or not sound particles will actually continue to supply additional new sounds. You know, kind of $200 is okay for the number of sounds that we have, but if there are no additional sounds added over the year, then the question is it worth actually renewing that? But if they keep up things the way they have started, I think that actually is a very good value, and I can only recommend it. And with that being said, if you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below, or once again join my Discord community and chat with us there. And other than that, see you at the next video.